The applause for the evening's guest of honor died into a vast, upholstered silence. In the opulent ballroom of the Sinclair Club, the absence of sound was so absolute it seemed to be a physical pressure, focusing the gaze of every guest on the polished floor between the tables. Crystal champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Conversations evaporated mid-sentence. 200 eyes in black tie and couture gowns locked onto the space where elegance met courage. 8-year-old Ethan Langston stood visibly trembling in his bespoke navy tuxedo, his small hand extended toward a figure in emerald green. The metal braces supporting his legs caught the chandelier light as he steadied himself against the tablecloth's edge, his fingers reaching across the invisible boundary between patron and staff. Monique Harris, the evening's contracted server, stood poised with a tray of champagne flutes balanced perfectly in one hand. Her emerald uniform was crisp against the room's muted opulence, her expression unreadable as she met the child's hopeful gaze. The string quartet had just transitioned into a waltz, and something in the melody, something pure and unplanned, had pulled the words from Ethan's lips before anyone could stop them. "Will you dance with me?" "Manage your employees." The head waiter's voice cut through the frozen moment like a blade of propriety. His face was rigid with professional horror as he materialized beside Monique, his hand moving to intercept. "This is the Langston Foundation Gala, not a children's party." From his seat at the head table, Richard Langston felt his throat constrict. His son, his foundation, his carefully constructed evening dissolving into a spectacle he couldn't control. But Monique Harris did something unexpected. She set down the tray with deliberate precision, removed her white serving glove finger by finger, and took Ethan's trembling hand in hers. The first step was agony. Not for Ethan, but for Richard, who watched his son's left foot slide forward with excruciating deliberation, the brace's hinge squeaking faintly against the polished marble. The sound transported him instantly to another night, 18 months ago, when those same hinges had been fitted in a sterile hospital room while Sarah held their son's hand and promised him everything would be okay. 3 weeks before the aneurysm took her, Richard's knuckles whitened against the stem of his champagne flute. On the dance floor, Monique had positioned herself with surprising skill, her posture adjusted to support without leading, to steady without controlling. Ethan's face, which moments before had been tight with the humiliation of being a spectacle, transformed. His jaw set with concentration. His small hand gripped hers with purpose. "One," he whispered, completing the step. The room remained frozen, 200 witnesses holding their collective breath. The second step came stronger. Ethan's right foot moved with more confidence, the rhythm of the waltz guiding him forward rather than constraining him. A bead of sweat appeared at his temple, but his eyes were luminous with something Richard hadn't seen in months. Pride. Not the manufactured pride of participation trophies or the hollow encouragement of paid therapists, but the raw, earned pride of leading another person across a dance floor. Richard felt something crack in his chest. "Two," Ethan breathed. Monique followed, not with pity or patronizing patience, but with genuine partnership. She moved when he moved, paused when he needed to gather himself, her face reflecting none of the discomfort that Richard saw in every specialist, every aide, every person who'd been paid to care. The third step nearly undid them both. Ethan's brace caught slightly, and for a heartbeat the boy wavered. But Monique's grip remained steady, allowing him to find his balance, to complete the movement on his own terms. "Three," Ethan said, and his voice carried triumph. That was when Richard moved. He was on his feet before conscious thought caught up, crossing the floor in 4 long strides, his hand already reaching for his son's shoulder. "That's enough." His voice came out harder than he intended. "Ethan, we need to return to the table." He turned to Monique, the years of boardroom authority flooding back into his posture. "My assistant will contact you tomorrow. 9 a.m. Langston Tower, 32nd floor." It wasn't a request. Monique released Ethan's hand slowly, her expression unreadable as she stepped back and retrieved her glove. As Richard guided his son back through the parting crowd, Ethan's whisper cut through every defense he'd built. Why did you stop it, Dad? I was leading. Langston Tower's lobby was designed to make people feel small. Monique understood this within 3 steps of entering. The ceiling vaulted 4 stories high, clad in Italian marble that caught and multiplied the morning light into something cold and mathematical. Her reflection fractured across polished surfaces, a woman in a simple gray blazer and practical flats, surrounded by men in suits that cost more than her monthly rent. She'd worn her best professional outfit. It wasn't enough, and that was intentional on their part. The receptionist's smile was glacial. 32nd floor. Mr. Klein is expecting you. The elevator was silent except for the soft chime marking each ascending level, each one a reminder of how far she was climbing into Richard Langston's world. When the doors opened, a man who could only be Klein stood waiting. Mid-50s, silver-haired, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent decades as the gatekeeper to power. Miss Harris. He didn't offer his hand. This way. He led her not to an office, but to a conference room with windows overlooking Manhattan. The city sprawled below like a kingdom, and she was meant to feel its weight. Klein remained standing, positioning himself between Monique and the door. Mr. Langston will join us shortly. In the meantime, I'll need to establish some preliminary information. He opened a leather portfolio with practiced precision. You work at Premier Service Solutions. 3 part-time positions currently. You're completing a master's degree in adaptive physical education at Hunter College. You're crazy, Klein said. You understand that? You could have changed your entire life. I already changed my life, Mr. Klein. 2 years ago when I started Ascend Steps. She glanced back one final time. The question is whether Mr. Langston is willing to change his. The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the vast space. Klein turned to Richard, his face flushed with anger and confusion. That woman is delusional. She just refused. Do you know how many people would kill for? Leave. Sir. Get out, Klein. The assistant gathered his folders with sharp, offended movements and exited, leaving Richard alone with the city sprawling below and 2 pieces of paper on the table. He picked up the business card. Simple white stock, black text, no logo. Just a name, an address in Washington Heights, and a phone number. The brochure was even simpler, featuring pixelated photographs of children in motion, smiling, attempting movements that conventional therapy would have labeled too ambitious. Richard had held billion-dollar contracts that weighed less in his hand. He sat in the silence of his conference room, surrounded by everything his money had built, and studied the card as if it were written in a language he'd never learned to speak. The black Mercedes sedan sat idling outside St. Augustine's Community Center for 11 minutes before the engine finally cut off. Inside, Richard Langston gripped the steering wheel with both hands, staring at a building that looked like it had been forgotten by every urban development plan for the past 40 years. The church basement entrance was marked by a hand-painted sign and a ramp that someone had clearly built themselves, the wood weathered but sturdy. Through the small windows at ground level, he could see. You've done your research. Mr. Langston is thorough. Klein's tone made it sound like a warning. I'll be direct, Miss Harris. Whatever you think happened last night, whatever gesture you believe you made, you need to understand the opportunity you're being offered here. People like you don't turn down offers like this. Monique met his gaze steadily. People like me. People who work 3 jobs to pay for graduate school. People who serve champagne at galas they could never afford to attend. He leaned forward slightly. People who are one medical emergency away from financial ruin. The door opened before she could respond. Richard Langston entered with the kind of controlled energy that filled a room without announcement. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, and his face carried the same exhausted authority she'd seen the night before. He sat at the head of the table and said nothing. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. Monique realized this was intentional, a technique to make her uncomfortable, to make her speak first and reveal her position. She waited. Klein shifted his weight. Richard's expression remained granite. The city hummed 32 floors below. Finally, after nearly a minute, Richard spoke. You let my son lead. Richard slid a folder across the table. Monique didn't open it. Hunter College, Masters in Adaptive Physical Education. Thesis focus on non-directive movement therapy for children with mobility impairments. GPA 3.9 despite working 28 hours a week at Premier Service, 16 at the campus library, and another 12 doing private tutoring. He paused. You also co-founded something called Ascend Steps 2 years ago, a community program operating out of a church basement in Washington Heights. Monique's jaw tightened slightly, but she said nothing. You're not just a waitress. Richard leaned back in his chair. You're overqualified, overextended, and underfunded. Which brings us to why you're here. He nodded to Klein, who produced a second folder. This one he opened, revealing a single sheet of paper with numbers that made Monique's breath catch despite herself. $150,000 annually. Full benefits. Your only responsibility would be Ethan. Not as a therapist, not as a caregiver. As a companion. Someone who lets him lead. Richard's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd never been refused. You'd have access to our facilities, our resources, and complete flexibility with your academic schedule. I'll cover the remainder of your tuition. The offer hung in the air like a gilded cage. You investigated me. Monique's voice was quiet. I investigate everyone who gets close to my son. And you think this is close? 3 steps on a dance floor. Those 3 steps meant something. For the first time, something cracked in Richard's composure. I haven't seen him look like that since before the accident. Since before his mother died. Monique stood slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Mr. Langston, I'm sorry for your loss. I truly am. But I'm not for sale. Klein made a sound of disbelief. Miss Harris, perhaps you didn't hear the... I heard the number. She kept her eyes on Richard. And I understand what it represents. You've built an empire by identifying problems and buying solutions. But your son isn't a problem. He's a child who needs his father to see him as capable, not broken. What happened last night wasn't therapy. It wasn't a service I provided. It was basic human dignity, and you can't purchase that in a conference room 32 floors above the people you think you're better than. Richard's face hardened. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for him. I know you stopped him from dancing. I know you treated a moment of joy like it was something shameful that needed to be controlled. Monique moved toward the door. You can't buy a solution to an emotional problem, Mr. Langston. And you can't hire someone to teach your son what you're too afraid to learn yourself. Monique paused at the door, her hand on the brushed steel handle. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, worn at the edges from living in her wallet. Beneath it, a trifold brochure printed on cheap paper, the kind that came from a community print shop rather than a corporate marketing firm. She placed both on the conference table. Ascend Steps meets Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 6 to 8. Saturday mornings, 9 to 11. Her voice had softened, but the steel beneath remained. We work with 15 kids right now. Different abilities, different challenges. Some use braces like Ethan. Some use wheelchairs. Some have conditions you've probably never heard of because they're too rare to attract research funding. Richard stared at the materials, but didn't touch them. We don't fix them, Mr. Langston. We give them space to lead, to make choices about their own bodies, to fail and succeed on their own terms. She pushed the brochure closer to him. Your son doesn't need another expert telling him what he can't do. He doesn't need someone paid to manufacture confidence. He needs a place where he can discover what's already inside him. This is insane. Klein's voice cracked with indignation. You walk away from a 6-figure salary to invite him to a church basement? Monique smiled faintly. I'm not inviting him. I'm inviting Ethan. She looked directly at Richard. Whether you come with him is your choice. She opened the door. Movement. Hear the faint sound of music and laughter. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, his face pressed against the window. Is this it, Dad? Richard's throat was dry. Yes. Can we go in? The question hung between them like a challenge. Inside the center, Monique glanced at her watch and smiled. He won't show, her co-founder, Dr. Navila Khan, said while adjusting the foam mats on the floor. Men like that don't come to places like this. He'll come. Monique moved to the window, catching sight of the sedan that looked absurdly out of place on the narrow street. He's been sitting out there for 10 minutes. That's not coming. That's contemplating. Same thing for a man like Richard Langston. Monique turned back to help a young girl named Sophia position her walker. Pride takes longer to park than cars do. Outside, Richard finally opened his door. He dressed wrong, he realized immediately. The casual blazer and designer jeans that his stylist had assured him were appropriate for informal community engagement looked like exactly what they were, a rich man's idea of dressing down. The other parents arriving wore work uniforms, tired faces, clothes that had been washed 100 times. He helped Ethan out of the car, steadying him as his son adjusted his braces on the uneven sidewalk. A woman pushing a child in a wheelchair smiled at them in passing. Richard nodded awkwardly, unsure of the protocol. "Dad, your hand is shaking," Ethan said quietly. Richard looked down. His son was right. "I'm fine. You don't have to be scared. Miss Monique is nice." "I'm not scared." But he was. Not of the building or the neighborhood or even of Monique Harris. He was terrified of the possibility that she was right, that everything he'd done for the past 18 months, every specialist hired, every piece of equipment purchased, every carefully controlled therapy session, had been the wrong kind of help. He was terrified that 3 steps on a dance floor had given his son something that millions of dollars couldn't buy. Richard took a breath, placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, and walked toward the entrance. Each step a battle between the man he'd been and the father he needed to become. The basement smelled like rubber mats and children's sweat, and something Richard couldn't quite identify. Hope, perhaps, or simply the absence of institutional sterility. 15 children moved through the space with varying degrees of assistance, some with parents hovering nearby, others navigating independently. Music played from a modest speaker system, and the walls were covered with artwork clearly made by the participants themselves. Monique met them 3 steps inside. "Ethan, welcome. We've been waiting for you." "Not you both. Just Ethan." His son's face lit up in a way that made Richard's chest tighten. "Come on, I'll introduce you to everyone." Monique extended her hand to Ethan, who took it without hesitation and allowed himself to be led toward a group of children near the far wall. Richard stood abandoned in the doorway until a woman in her late 40s approached, her hijab the color of deep plum, her eyes carrying the particular sharpness of someone who missed nothing. "Mr. Langston, I'm Dr. Navila Khan. I co-founded Ascend Steps with Monique." She didn't offer her hand, simply gestured toward a small observation area with folding chairs. "We should talk while Ethan acclimates." They sat, and Richard watched his son being welcomed into a circle where a boy in a wheelchair was demonstrating some kind of spinning movement that the others were attempting to mirror. Ascend Steps is built on research in neuroplasticity and autonomy supportive pedagogy. Dr. Khan began, her tone clinical but not cold. Children with mobility differences are too often subjected to directive therapy that reinforces dependence. We use a non-directive approach that allows them to set their own movement goals and discover their own capabilities. "That sounds," Richard began, "familiar." Dr. Khan smiled without humor. "It should. You've read our funding proposal. 3 times, actually." The words hit him like cold water. The Langston Foundation rejected our application in 2023, again in early 2024, and most recently 6 months ago. She pulled a folder from beneath her chair and opened it to reveal his foundation's letterhead. Each time, the feedback noted insufficient preliminary data and concerns about scalability. Richard's face went numb. Monique had returned, standing just behind Dr. Khan with her arms crossed. "I didn't know who Ethan was when he asked me to dance, but I knew who you were. I'd seen your picture on the rejection letters. So the gala was a chance to show you what your foundation's data analysts couldn't measure." Monique's voice was steady. "I didn't plan for Ethan to ask me, but when he did, I chose to let you see what we do. Not in a proposal, in real life." Richard looked at his son, laughing as he attempted a movement alongside children who understood his struggles without judgment. "You used him." "No, Mr. Langston." Dr. Khan closed the folder. "We gave him a chance to lead. You're the one who's been using him as a project to be managed rather than a person to be known." The door opened and 3 people with cameras entered, followed by a woman with a notepad and a man adjusting a portable microphone. Richard's head snapped toward Monique with a look that could have shattered steel. "What is this?" "Community Press Day," Monique said calmly. "We scheduled it 2 weeks ago. Local outlets covering neighborhood programs. You orchestrated this." Richard was on his feet, his voice low and dangerous. "You brought me here, exposed my son to this setup, and now you're turning it into a publicity stunt. Mr. Langston, if you'll just don't." He moved toward Ethan, intent on extracting him from what he now saw clearly as manipulation. "We're leaving." "Dad, wait." Ethan's voice cut through the rising tension. But Richard was already reaching for him when one of the reporters recognized him. "Mr. Langston?" "Richard Langston from the Langston Foundation." "Sir, can we ask why you're here today?" The other children had stopped moving. Parents turned to watch. The entire basement held its breath as the billionaire and the press converged in the space where vulnerability met exposure. Richard opened his mouth to deliver the kind of statement that would shut this down, protect his privacy, and obliterate any narrative Monique thought she was building. That's when Ethan moved. His son stepped away from the wall he'd been using for support, his small hands moving to the Velcro straps on his leg braces. "I want to try," he said quietly. "Ethan, no." Richard's authority dissolved into something closer to fear. "You're not ready. You don't know that." Ethan's voice was steady, stronger than Richard had heard it in months. "You never let me try." The room went silent. Even the reporters lowered their cameras, sensing something too raw to interrupt. Ethan removed his right brace completely. His leg trembled, the muscles fighting for stability they'd relied on metal to provide. He looked at Monique, who nodded once but didn't move to help. Then Ethan stepped forward. Not a shuffle, not a drag, a complete, deliberate step without support, his body wavering, but his determination absolute. The effort contorted his face, sweat appearing instantly on his forehead, but he held the position for 2 full seconds before his left foot, still braced, came forward to meet it. He'd moved himself across 3 feet of open floor. Richard felt something break open in his chest, a dam he'd built from grief and control and the terror of losing another person he loved. Tears came without permission, blurring his vision as he watched his son stand independently, shaking but triumphant, in the center of a church basement while strangers documented the moment he'd been too afraid to allow. Ethan looked at his father and smiled. Richard stood before the assembled reporters, the camera lights harsh against his skin. For the first time in his career, he had no prepared statement, no carefully crafted narrative, just the weight of his own reckoning. "I was wrong," he said, and the room fell silent. "I looked at Ascend Steps and saw a project to optimize, metrics to measure, a system to control. I didn't see people. I didn't see transformation." His voice caught. "I saw my daughter struggling with her reading, and instead of listening to what she needed, I imposed what I thought was best. I did the same thing to an entire program that was already changing lives." He outlined his commitment: full funding for 5 years, with automatic renewals contingent only on the program's own standards of success. A permanent facility, designed in consultation with Monique and her team. Resources for expansion, for research, for whatever vision they held. "My only condition is that I have no conditions," he continued. "Monique Hart will retain complete autonomy over the program's direction, methodology, and mission. I'm not a donor. I'm not a partner. I'm someone trying to learn what I should have understood from the beginning." 6 months later, Richard arrived at Ascend Steps carrying a stack of books on neuroplasticity, motor learning, and trauma-informed care. He'd been coming twice a week, always asking permission, never assuming access. Today, he was helping Marcus organize the equipment room when Monique passed by. "Question," he said, looking up from a bin of resistance bands. "In your observation notes, you mentioned Tyler's breakthrough came after you switched from verbal cues to tactile guidance. Was that instinctive or based on something specific?" Monique paused, studying him. He'd lost the polish that used to armor him, replaced by something more uncertain but somehow more solid. "The research on embodied cognition," she said. "Some kids process physical information before they can process language about movement." Richard nodded, making a note. That makes sense. I'm reading Damasio now, trying to understand. He stopped, seemed to catch himself. Sorry, you don't need me theorizing about your work. You're learning, Monique said. That's different. He set down his notebook. I need to know something. Why didn't you ever accept my apology? I've apologized dozens of times. Monique met his eyes steadily. No, Richard. You offered compensation. You made commitments. You promised resources. She stepped closer. But you never actually apologized. You explained your mistakes. You pledged to do better. You wrote checks. That's not the same as saying, I'm sorry, and meaning it without the transaction attached. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. For a long moment, he simply stood there, the truth of her words settling into him like something he should have known all along. You're right, he said finally, quietly. I'm sorry, Monique. I'm sorry. She nodded once. Okay then. Now we can move forward. The ribbon cutting felt less like a corporate event and more like a homecoming. The new Ascend Steps facility stood 3 stories high, its wide windows flooding the gymnasium with natural light. Parents clustered near the entrance, kids darted between legs, and somewhere inside, music was already playing. Richard stood toward the back, deliberately out of the spotlight. He watched Ethan move through the warm-up routine with the other kids, his son's movements still careful but unmistakably confident. The lightweight ankle brace was barely visible under his sneakers. No handler hovering. No anxious glances seeking approval. Just a 12-year-old boy doing something hard because he'd learned he could. A reporter he vaguely recognized approached with a microphone. Mr. Chun, this is quite a transformation from where we were a year ago. What would you say you've learned from this experience? Richard kept his eyes on Ethan, who was now demonstrating a balanced sequence for a younger child, his hands steady as he guided the boy's positioning. I learned to follow, Richard said simply. My whole life, I've been trained to lead, to optimize, to fix. I thought that's what good fathers did, what effective leaders did. But sometimes the most important thing you can do is get out of the way and let people who actually understand the work do what they do best. That's quite a shift for someone in your position. It had to be. Richard finally looked at the reporter. I almost destroyed something precious because I couldn't distinguish between my fear and my son's needs. I'm grateful I was stopped before I could do more damage. On the floor, Monique was introducing the new instructors, 3 specialists she'd trained herself. The program had already expanded to serve twice as many kids, with a waiting list that stretched into next year. 2 other cities had reached out about replicating the model. A university research team was documenting outcomes. Richard watched Ethan complete the routine and break into a grin, high-fiving Marcus with unself-conscious joy. 6 months ago, his son couldn't walk across a room without assistance. Now he was helping other kids find their own balance. Sarah appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. He's amazing, she whispered. He always was, Richard said. I just couldn't see it. The ceremony concluded with the kids performing a group routine they'd choreographed themselves. Ethan was in the middle, not leading, not following, just moving with the collective rhythm. His steps weren't perfect. They didn't need to be. Afterward, as families gathered for refreshments, Ethan found Richard in the crowd. Did you see? He asked, slightly breathless. I saw everything, Richard said, and pulled his son into a hug. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Dad. Ethan squeezed back, then pulled away to rejoin his friends. Richard let him go.